On the coldest night of December, in a mansion overlooking the Dallas skyline, Margaret Bennett discovered something no wife should ever see. Her husband's car, parked 2 blocks away, a restaurant receipt for 2, and the perfume on his scarf, a scent she didn't wear. But she didn't scream, she didn't call him, she didn't beg for answers. Instead, she walked into his private study, unlocked his safe with the code he thought she didn't know, and placed inside it a single envelope that would change the course of his entire empire, because inside that envelope wasn't just a goodbye. It was the one truth he prayed she would never learn, and when he finally opened it, his knees buckled, not because she left, but because of what she took with her. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. But how did a night meant for love, warmth, and family turn into the moment that shattered a marriage? What pushed Margaret, a woman known for quiet dignity, to walk away without a word? And what secret did she place in that envelope? A secret powerful enough to bring a grown man to his knees. Tonight, we tell a story not just about betrayal, but about the moment a woman rediscovers who she truly is. This is a story about love that turned into lies, about trust that crumbled into dust, and about a woman who found the strength to reclaim everything she'd lost. Stay until the end, because the twist will leave you breathless. And I promise you, by the time we reach the conclusion, you'll never look at loyalty, love, or second chances the same way again. Margaret Bennett wasn't just a wife. She was the quiet architect behind her husband's rise. David Bennett, charming, ambitious, adored by Dallas society, built a real estate empire that stretched from Houston to Chicago. His face was in magazines, his voice echoed in boardrooms, his handshake closed deals worth millions. But behind every step, Margaret was there, handling the books when the company couldn't afford an accountant, hosting dinners that secured million-dollar deals, offering grace even when he didn't deserve it. Their marriage began like a winter fairy tale, 2 dreamers in a small Texas apartment promising each other a future built on loyalty and love. But success changes some men. For David, it changed everything. Margaret had grown up on a ranch outside Austin, a place where the sky stretched endlessly and the land remembered every footstep. Her father, a hard-working man with calloused hands and a gentle heart, had built that land from nothing. He raised cattle, grew crops, and taught Margaret the value of honest work. She remembered summer mornings when she was 7, following him through the fields, her small boots crunching on dry grass. He'd point to the horizon and say, "One day, Margaret, all of this will be yours. Take care of it. It's not just land, it's legacy. It's who we are." When he passed away 5 years into her marriage, he left that land to her, his only child. It was more than property. It was memory. It was the smell of summer hay and the sound of her father's laughter echoing across open fields. David knew what that land meant to her. He'd held her as she cried at the funeral. He'd promised to protect it, honor it, keep it safe. And for a while, she believed he would. But then the empire grew. David's ambitions swelled. The deals got bigger, the stakes got higher. And somewhere along the way, Margaret stopped being his partner. She became his accessory, the beautiful wife in the background, the woman who smiled at charity galas and poured wine for investors, the woman whose name was on the company's founding documents, but whose voice was no longer heard in the conference room. She told herself it was temporary, that once things settled, they'd find their way back to each other. But things never settled. They only got louder, faster, more chaotic, and Margaret found herself alone in a house that felt less like a home and more like a museum of a marriage that used to exist. The shift didn't happen overnight. It was gradual, almost invisible at first. David started coming home later. 11 at night became midnight. Midnight became 2 in the morning. He'd slip into bed smelling of cologne and whiskey, his body turned away from hers. When she asked where he'd been, he'd sigh, exhausted, and say, "Investors, Margaret, you know how it is." And she did know. She knew the pressures of building an empire. She knew the sacrifices required. So she swallowed her questions and made him breakfast in the morning, hoping he'd notice, hoping he'd say thank you. But he rarely did. He'd scroll through his phone, answer emails, rush out the door with barely a glance in her direction. And Margaret would stand there in the kitchen, coffee growing cold in her hands, wondering when she'd become invisible. Their conversations, once filled with dreams and laughter, became transactional. "Did you pay the caterer for the fundraiser? Can you pick up my dry cleaning? I need you to charm the Hendersons at dinner tonight." They're thinking of investing. Margaret performed each task flawlessly because that's what she'd always done. She supported him. She believed in him. She convinced herself that this was just a phase, that once the business stabilized, they'd reconnect. But the business never stabilized. It only grew, consuming more of David's time, more of his attention, more of his soul. And with each passing month, Margaret felt herself shrinking, her opinions dismissed, her feelings ignored, her presence taken for granted. She started noticing other things too. Perfume on his shirts, expensive and floral, definitely not the light vanilla scent she wore. Receipts tucked into his jacket pockets, restaurants she'd never been to, amounts that suggested intimate dinners for two. Phone calls he'd take in another room, his voice dropping to a whisper, ending abruptly when she walked in. She tried to ignore it, tried to convince herself it was paranoia, exhaustion, her imagination creating problems that didn't exist. But deep down, in that place where intuition lives, she knew. She knew something was breaking. She knew someone else was filling the space she used to occupy. And she knew that confronting him would either shatter the illusion completely or force her to accept a truth she wasn't ready to face. So she stayed quiet. She played the role of the perfect wife. She smiled at his colleagues, laughed at their jokes, pretended everything was fine. But inside, she was drowning. Inside, she was disappearing. And the worst part wasn't the betrayal itself. It was the realization that David didn't even notice she was gone. He didn't notice the sadness in her eyes. He didn't notice how she'd stopped asking about his day. He didn't notice how she'd moved her things to the guest room 3 months ago, claiming she didn't want to disturb him when he came home late. He didn't notice because he didn't care. And that realization cut deeper than any affair ever could. The shift came slowly, and then all at once. Christmas Eve, the one night Margaret asked for nothing but time together, a few hours, a quiet dinner, a moment to reconnect. She'd spent the entire day preparing his favorite meal, roasted lamb with rosemary, garlic mashed potatoes, the apple pie his mother used to make. She'd set the table with their wedding china, lit candles, put on the red dress he used to love. She'd even bought him a gift, a vintage watch he'd mentioned months ago, something she'd saved for because she knew it would make him smile. David promised he'd be home by 6. By 9, no calls. By midnight, silence. Something inside Margaret broke. Not anger, not rage, not tears, just a quiet, chilling clarity. She sat at the dining table alone, staring at the food growing cold, the candles burning down to stubs. She thought about calling him, but what would she say? "Where are you? Why did you lie to me again? What's more important than the woman who's been waiting for you since this morning?" She knew the answers wouldn't satisfy her. They never did. So instead, she stood up, walked to the window, and stared out at the Dallas skyline. The city glittered with Christmas lights, families gathered in warm homes, people celebrating love and togetherness. And here she was, alone in a mansion that felt like a mausoleum. She stepped outside into the cold, the Texas wind sharp against her cheeks. And then she saw it. David's Mercedes, parked 2 blocks away, beside a candle-lit restaurant. Her heart didn't race. Her hands didn't shake. She simply walked, one foot in front of the other, following the trail like a woman walking through a dream. The restaurant was upscale, the kind of place David took clients when he wanted to impress them. Through the frosted windows, she could see couples laughing, clinking glasses, lost in their own worlds. And then she saw him, David, seated in a corner booth, leaning across the table toward a woman Margaret didn't recognize. She was young, mid-20s maybe, with dark hair and a confident smile. She wore a black dress that hugged her figure, diamond earrings that caught the light, and David was looking at her the way he used to look at Margaret, with interest, with desire, with the kind of attention that makes you feel like you're the only person in the room. Margaret moved to the side of the building, into the shadows where she could see but not be seen. She watched as David reached across the table and took the woman's hand, watched as the woman laughed at something he said, her head tilted back, her eyes sparkling, watched as David lifted her hand to his lips and kissed it gently, intimately, possessively. And then they stood, David helping the woman into her coat, his hand lingering on the small of her back. They walked out of the restaurant together, and Margaret followed at a distance, her breath visible in the cold night air. They stopped in the alley beside the restaurant, and that's when Margaret saw it. The kiss, not a polite peck, not a friendly goodbye, but a deep, passionate kiss that spoke of familiarity, of history, of promises made in private. But that wasn't what shattered Margaret. It was the look in his eyes when he pulled back and smiled at the woman. Joy, comfort, relief. A look he hadn't given his wife in years. A look that said, "This is where I want to be. This is who I want to be with. This is the life I've chosen." Margaret stood there, frozen, watching the man she'd loved for 15 years hold another woman like she was his entire world. And in that moment, something inside Margaret died. Not her love for him, that had been fading for months, but her hope, her belief that things could get better, her faith that the man she married still existed somewhere beneath the layers of ambition and arrogance. That man was gone, and standing in his place was a stranger who'd forgotten her completely. She didn't confront them. She didn't scream. She simply walked home, step by icy step, letting the truth settle like frost around her heart. Her feet moved on autopilot, carrying her back to the mansion, back to the life that no longer felt like hers. When she reached the house, everything looked the same. The Christmas tree in the corner, still lit. The dining table, still set. The candles, burned down to nothing. But Margaret felt different, colder, clearer, like she'd been sleepwalking for years and had just woken up. She walked into David's study, the room he always kept locked, the room she was never supposed to enter without permission. But tonight, she didn't care about permission. Tonight, she was done playing by his rules. She opened drawers, rifled through files, searched for answers to questions she'd been too afraid to ask, and then she found it. A second phone, hidden under a stack of papers in the bottom drawer of his desk. She picked it up, her hands steady, and turned it on. The screen lit up with notifications, messages, photos, emails, all from the same woman she'd just seen him with. Her name was Vanessa. Margaret scrolled through the messages, each one a knife to the heart. "I miss you. When can I see you again? Last night was incredible. I can't wait for our trip to Aspen." And then, the message that made Margaret's blood run cold. "I can't believe we're finally doing this, starting our life together. You make me feel alive, David. Thank you for choosing me." Margaret set the phone down and opened the safe. She knew the combination. David thought she didn't, but she'd watched him open it dozens of times over the years. Inside were documents, financial statements, contracts, and then she saw it. A wire transfer, $250,000 to Vanessa's name, dated 3 weeks ago. Below it, another document, a contract transferring Margaret's inherited land, the land her father had left her, into Vanessa's name, signed by David, forged with Margaret's signature. Margaret stared at the paper, her vision blurring. This wasn't just an affair. This was theft. This was betrayal on a level she couldn't comprehend. He wasn't just replacing her, he was erasing her, taking everything she had, everything her father had worked for, and giving it to someone else. She thought about all the times she'd defended him to her friends, to her family, when her sister had said, "Margaret, are you sure he's not cheating?" When her best friend had warned her, "Something's not right with David." When her father, months before he died, had pulled her aside and said, "That man loves your land more than he loves you. Be careful." Margaret had dismissed them all, defended David, insisted they didn't understand the pressure he was under. But they'd been right. They'd seen what she refused to see. And now, standing in his study with evidence of his betrayal in her hands, she finally understood. David had never loved her. He'd loved what she could give him, her father's land, her support, her silence. And now that he had what he needed, he was discarding her like she was nothing. Margaret looked around the study one more time, at the mahogany desk, at the leather chairs, at the framed photos on the wall, pictures of David shaking hands with politicians, cutting ribbons at grand openings, accepting awards. In every photo, he was smiling, confident, successful, and in none of them was Margaret. She'd been edited out of his narrative long before tonight. She was the ghost in his story, the woman who existed only in the footnotes, and she was done being invisible. She was done being silent. She was done being the woman who waited at home while he built a life that didn't include her. That night, in the cold silence of his study, Margaret made a decision. She wasn't going to beg. She wasn't going to cry. She wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of seeing her broken. Instead, she was going to do something he'd never expect. She was going to take back what was hers. If this story has your heart racing right now, comment, "I'm still watching." Let's see how many of you are following this emotional journey to the end. And let me ask you something. How would you feel if you discovered the person you trusted most had been erasing you, legally and emotionally, for years? Would you fight back immediately, or would you take your time and plan your move carefully like Margaret? Would you confront them face to face and demand answers, or would you walk away in silence, letting your actions speak louder than words? Think about it for a moment. Really think about it. Because it's easy to say what we do when we're not the ones standing in that cold study, holding evidence of our partner's betrayal. It's easy to be brave, in theory, but in reality, when your heart is breaking and your world is collapsing, decisions become much harder. So, drop your honest thoughts in the comments. No judgment here, just real people sharing real perspectives. Because what Margaret does next might surprise you. It might inspire you. Or it might make you question everything you thought you knew about revenge, justice, and moving on. Margaret spent the next day moving like a ghost, silent, composed, observing everything with new eyes. She woke up early, before dawn, and sat in the kitchen with a cup of coffee she didn't drink. The house was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic outside. David hadn't come home. She checked her phone. No messages, no calls, no explanation. Not that she expected one. Not anymore. She looked around the kitchen, at the marble countertops David had insisted on installing, at the high-end appliances they rarely used, at the designer light fixtures that cost more than her father's monthly income. This house wasn't a home, it was a showroom, a display of wealth that meant nothing without love to fill it. She showered, dressed in simple jeans and a sweater, and drove out to the ranch, the land her father had left her, the land David had tried to steal. The gate creaked the same way it always had, a familiar sound that brought tears to her eyes. She parked the car and walked into the fields, the winter grass crunching beneath her boots. The air smelled like earth and memory. She walked to the old oak tree where her father's initials were carved, where he'd once told her, "This land is yours, Margaret. No matter what happens, it's yours. Protect it." She pressed her palm against the rough bark, feeling the grooves of the letters. TB, for Thomas Bennett, her father, her hero, the man who taught her everything about integrity, hard work, and standing up for what's right. "I'm so sorry, Daddy," she whispered. "I let him take it. I let him use it. But I promise you, I'm going to fix this. I'm going to protect what's ours." She spent an hour walking the property, remembering. The creek where she used to catch frogs with her cousins. The barn where her father taught her to ride when she was 6. The field where they'd had family picnics every 4th of July. Her mother spreading out blankets, her father grilling burgers, her younger brother running wild with the dog. Those memories felt sacred now, precious in a way they hadn't before, because David had tried to take them. He'd tried to turn this land, this legacy, into a transaction, into something he could trade away to impress his mistress. And that violation cut deeper than the affair itself. He'd stolen her history, her identity, her roots, and he'd done it without a second thought. Margaret drove back to Dallas and went straight to the family lawyer's office. Thomas Murphy had been her father's best friend for 30 years. He'd handled the estate when her father passed. He'd drawn up the deed that transferred the land to Margaret. He was a man of principle, the kind who still shook hands on deals and believed a person's word meant something. When Margaret walked into his office, he could see immediately that something was wrong. "Margaret," he said gently, standing to greet her. "What's happened?" She sat down across from him, placed the forged contract on his desk, and said, "David tried to steal my father's land." Thomas picked up the document, his face growing darker with each line he read. "This signature," he said slowly. "This isn't yours." "No," Margaret confirmed. "He forged it." Thomas leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. "Margaret, do you understand what this means?" She nodded. "Tell me, anyway." Thomas pulled out more files from his cabinet, spreading them across the desk. "Every major project David's built in the last 3 years, is tied to this land. The downtown development, the shopping complex in Houston, the residential towers in Austin, all of them were financed using your land as collateral. If the deed isn't legally transferred, if this document is proven to be a forgery, then those contracts are void, the loans default, the investors can sue. Everything collapses. Margaret stared at the papers, her mind racing. So you're saying, if I reclaim the land? Thomas nodded slowly. His empire falls apart. Not just the projects, his reputation, his credibility, everything he's built. Margaret took a deep breath. Good. Thomas looked at her carefully. Margaret, I have to ask, are you sure about this? Once we start this process, there's no going back. David will know. He'll fight. It could get ugly. Margaret met his eyes, her voice steady. He forged my signature. He tried to steal my father's land. He's been planning to leave me with nothing. So yes, Thomas, I'm sure. Thomas nodded and picked up his phone. I'm calling a forensic accountant. We need to document everything, every transaction, every account, every property tied to that land. And Margaret, he added, I need you to gather any other documents you can find. Bank statements, emails, anything that shows what he's been doing. Margaret left the office with a list of tasks and a renewed sense of purpose. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for her father's legacy, for the years of hard work he'd put into that land, for the trust he'd placed in her when he left it in her care, and she wasn't going to let David destroy it. She met with the forensic accountant, a sharp woman named Claire who specialized in uncovering financial fraud. Claire worked out of a small office downtown, the walls covered with certificates and commendations. She listened to Margaret's story without interruption, taking notes, asking pointed questions. When Margaret finished, Claire leaned forward. Margaret, what you're describing isn't just infidelity. This is systematic financial abuse. He's been siphoning money from joint accounts, hiding assets in offshore accounts, preparing to file for divorce and leave you with nothing. And this forged prenup, she held up the document Margaret had found. If this ever went to court, he'd claim you signed away your rights years ago. It's calculated, it's deliberate, and it's been happening for at least 2 years. Margaret felt nauseous. 2 years. 2 years of smiling at dinner parties while he stole from her. 2 years of believing his lies while he planned her erasure. 2 years of being played for a fool. Claire worked quickly, her fingers flying across the keyboard as she pulled up records, cross-referenced dates, highlighted inconsistencies. Within hours, she had a folder an inch thick. Look at this, Claire said, pointing to a spreadsheet on her screen. 3 months ago, David transferred $200,000 from your joint savings account into an account under Vanessa's name. 2 weeks later, he used funds from that account to purchase a condo in her name. Then there's this, she clicked to another document. He took out a loan using your land as collateral, but he never told you. The bank thinks you co-signed, but you didn't. He forged your signature on the loan documents too. Margaret stared at the screen, overwhelmed. How much? She asked quietly. How much did he steal? Claire hesitated. From what I can see so far, at least $800,000, maybe more. We'll know for sure once we audit everything. Margaret drove home that evening, her mind numb. $800,000. Money she'd inherited from her father. Money she'd earned from the sale of her mother's house after she passed. Money she'd contributed to their joint accounts because she trusted him, because she believed they were partners, because she thought marriage meant sharing everything, including finances. She'd been such a fool. She parked in the driveway and sat in the car for a long time, staring at the mansion. She thought about the first time David had brought her here, 5 years ago, when they'd just signed the deed. He'd carried her across the threshold, spinning her around in the foyer, both of them laughing. This is ours, Margaret, he'd said. Everything we've worked for, our dream home, our future. She'd believed him then, believed that they were building something together, but now she understood. This house was never theirs. It was his, built with her money, her land, her sacrifice, and she was just the tenant who'd overstayed her welcome. She went inside and found David in the living room, pouring himself a drink. He looked up when she entered, his expression carefully neutral. "Where have you been?" he asked. "Out," Margaret replied, her voice flat. He frowned. "Out? Where? It's almost 8. Margaret didn't answer. She walked past him, up the stairs, into the guest room where she'd been sleeping. She locked the door and sat on the edge of the bed, her hands shaking. Not from fear, not from sadness, but from anger. Pure, righteous anger, because she'd given this man everything. Her youth, her trust, her father's land, her inheritance, her belief that love could conquer all. And he'd taken it all and thrown it away for a younger woman and a bigger empire. Well, she thought, staring at her reflection in the mirror, if he wants an empire, he can have it, but not on my land, not with my money, not at my expense. Christmas night, the night she found him with his mistress, was not the end. It was the beginning. Margaret spent the next 2 days gathering evidence, documenting everything, building a case that couldn't be refuted. She copied files from David's computer while he slept. She photographed documents in his study. She recorded conversations with the forensic accountant, the lawyer, the bank representatives who confirmed that her signature on the loan documents looked suspicious. She was methodical, precise, calm, because this wasn't about revenge. This was about justice. This was about reclaiming what was rightfully hers, and she was going to do it the right way, legally and thoroughly, so there would be no question about who owned what when this was all over. On the third day, Margaret walked into David's study one final time. She opened his safe, removed all the forged documents, and placed them in a folder marked Evidence. Then she took out a single piece of paper, folded it carefully, and placed it inside the safe along with the original title deed to her father's land. The deed David thought he'd replaced with a forgery. The deed that proved Margaret had never transferred ownership. The deed that meant every contract, every loan, every development David had built in the last 3 years was based on a lie. She closed the safe, locked it, and walked out of the study without looking back, because this chapter of her life was over, and she was ready to start the next one. The letter she left was simple, no accusations, no anger, just the truth, written in her careful, elegant handwriting. David, you built everything on land that was never yours, and you forgot the woman who stood beside you. I am reclaiming what my father left me. The contracts, the loans, the developments, they're all based on a forged deed. You made sure I had no legal claim to your empire, but you forgot that your empire was built on my land. I've contacted the investors, the banks, the City Planning Commission. They'll be reaching out soon. Merry Christmas, David, Margaret. She sealed the envelope, placed it in the safe alongside the original deed, and closed the heavy door. The click echoed in the silent room. Final, irreversible, done. Margaret packed a single suitcase. She took her grandmother's jewelry, the pieces that had been passed down through generations. She took the photo albums from her childhood, pictures of her parents, her brother, family gatherings on the ranch. She took her father's pocket watch, the one he'd carried every day of his life. She took the quilt her mother had made before she passed, stitched with pieces of fabric from Margaret's baby clothes. She didn't take the designer dresses David had bought her. She didn't take the expensive shoes, or the handbags, or the jewelry he'd given her on anniversaries he barely remembered. Those things weren't hers. They were props in a life that wasn't real. They were costumes for a role she was done playing. She walked through the mansion one last time, her footsteps echoing on the marble floors. She paused in the doorway of the master bedroom, looking at the bed they'd shared for 15 years. The California king with the Egyptian cotton sheets David insisted on, the mahogany nightstands with matching lamps, the walk-in closet bigger than her childhood bedroom. Everything was expensive. Everything was beautiful. And none of it mattered, because you can't sleep peacefully in a bed built on lies. You can't find comfort in a home where you're not truly wanted. Margaret turned off the light and closed the door, sealing that chapter of her life shut. She drove to a small hotel on the outskirts of Dallas, checking in under her maiden name. The room was modest, clean, quiet. A double bed with a floral comforter, a small TV on the dresser, a bathroom with white tiles and basic toiletries. It was the opposite of the mansion in every way, and somehow it felt more like home than that house ever had. Margaret sat on the edge of the bed and finally let herself cry. Not for David, not for the marriage, but for the years she'd lost, for the woman she'd been before she met him, for the girl on the ranch who'd believed that love and loyalty were enough, for the dreams she'd set aside to support his, for every compromise, every sacrifice, Every moment she'd made herself smaller so he could feel bigger. She cried until there were no tears left, and then she slept, deeply and dreamlessly, for the first time in months. When she woke the next morning, the sun was streaming through the thin curtains. She checked her phone. 7 missed calls from David, 12 text messages, all sent between 2 and 4 in the morning. She didn't read them. She didn't need to. She already knew what they'd say. Panic, confusion, anger, blame, demands, threats. The progression was predictable. First, he'd try to manipulate her emotions. Then he'd try to intimidate her legally. Then, when neither worked, he'd try to negotiate. But Margaret wasn't interested in any of it. She'd made her move. Now she'd let the consequences unfold. The first consequence came at 9:15 that morning. Thomas called. "Margaret," he said, his voice tight with controlled excitement. "The bank just froze David's accounts. All of them. They've launched an investigation into the fraudulent loan documents. The investors are pulling out of the downtown development, and the City Planning Commission just issued a stop work order on all his active projects. It's happening." Margaret closed her eyes, feeling a strange mix of relief and sadness. "Thank you, Thomas." He paused. "How are you holding up?" She thought about the question. "Honestly, I feel free." There was a smile in his voice. "Your father would be proud." Margaret hung up and stared out the hotel window at the Dallas skyline. Somewhere out there, David's world was collapsing. His empire, built on stolen land and forged signatures, was crumbling. And for the first time in years, Margaret didn't feel guilty. She didn't feel responsible for his pain, because he'd made his choices, and now he had to live with them. When David came home at 2:17 that morning, 3 days after Christmas, smelling of wine and another woman's perfume, he saw the safe open. The first thing he felt was irritation. Margaret knew she wasn't supposed to go into his study without permission. She knew the safe was off limits. He walked over, ready to lecture her about boundaries and respect. Then he saw the missing documents, the forged contracts, the wire transfers, all gone, and in their place, a single envelope and a document he thought he'd successfully replaced, the original deed to Margaret's land. His hands shook as he picked up the envelope, saw his name written in Margaret's handwriting, opened it with growing dread. He read the letter once, then again, then a third time, as if repetition would change the words. "You built everything on land that was never yours." The sentence echoed in his mind, louder with each repetition. He stumbled backward, his legs suddenly weak, and sat down hard in his leather desk chair. This wasn't possible. He'd been so careful. He'd forged the signatures perfectly. He'd filed the paperwork through channels that wouldn't raise questions. He'd covered his tracks. How had she known? How had she found out? And more importantly, how had she moved so quickly to dismantle everything? He grabbed his phone and called his lawyer. It was 2:30 in the morning, but this couldn't wait. The lawyer answered on the 4th ring, groggy and annoyed. "This better be important, David." "It is," David said, his voice shaking. "Margaret found out about the land transfer. She has the original deed. She's contacted the banks and investors. What do I do?" There was a long pause. Then the lawyer, now fully awake, said 4 words that made David's blood run cold. "You're completely exposed." The lawyer explained in brutal detail. Every contract tied to that land was now invalid. Every loan was technically fraud. The investors could sue for misrepresentation. The banks could press criminal charges. The city could fine him for proceeding with developments on illegally obtained collateral. And Margaret, if she chose to pursue it, could have him arrested for forgery and fraud. "You need to settle with her," the lawyer said. "Immediately. Give her whatever she wants. Beg if you have to. Because if this goes to court, you'll lose everything, including your freedom." David hung up and stared at his phone, watching as notifications started flooding in. Emails from investors demanding explanations, messages from his business partners asking what the hell was going on, a text from his accountant saying the banks had frozen all his accounts pending investigation, and then a message from Vanessa. "David, what's happening? Someone called me asking questions about money you transferred to my account. I'm scared. Are we in trouble?" David didn't respond. He couldn't, because the truth was too humiliating to admit. He'd destroyed everything for a woman who would disappear the moment the money stopped flowing. He'd betrayed the one person who truly loved him. And now he was paying the price. By morning, the news had spread through Dallas society like wildfire. David Bennett's empire was collapsing, contracts being cancelled, projects shut down, investors fleeing. The man who'd been untouchable, whose name had been synonymous with success, was now synonymous with fraud. The phones at his office rang constantly with demands, threats, legal notices. His secretary quit. 3 of his top executives resigned. His business partners scheduled an emergency meeting to discuss removing him from the board. In less than 12 hours, David went from being one of Dallas's most successful developers to being a cautionary tale about greed and hubris. He tried to call Margaret, over and over, but she never answered. He showed up at her sister's house, banging on the door at 7 in the morning, demanding to know where Margaret was. Her sister, Emily, opened the door with cold eyes. "She's somewhere you'll never find her." "And David?" She stepped closer, her voice dropping. "You deserve everything that's happening to you." She slammed the door in his face. He drove to the ranch, thinking maybe Margaret had gone there, to the land that had caused all this trouble. But when he arrived, the gate was locked with a heavy chain and a new padlock. A sign hung from the fence. "Private property. No trespassing. Trespassers will be prosecuted." He stood there for a long moment, staring at the land through the fence. The fields stretched out under a pale winter sky, peaceful and unchanged. This was the land that had started everything. The land her father had worked his entire life to build. The land David had tried to steal without a second thought. And now it was locked away from him, just like Margaret herself. David hired investigators to find her, spent thousands of dollars tracking her movements, checking hotels, following leads. But Margaret had planned carefully. She'd closed their joint accounts and transferred her personal savings to a new bank. She'd changed her phone number. She'd arranged for her mail to be forwarded to Thomas's office. She'd become a ghost, invisible and unreachable. And in his desperation, David finally understood what he'd lost. Not the land, not the money, not even the empire, but the woman who'd loved him when he was nobody, the woman who'd believed in him when no one else did, the woman who'd given him everything and asked for nothing but his love in return. 3 weeks after Margaret left, David sat in what used to be his office, surrounded by boxes. The building had been sold to cover debts. His employees had all moved on. His partners had severed ties. The mistress, Vanessa, had stopped returning his calls the moment she realized the money was gone. She'd even hired a lawyer, claiming she had no knowledge of where the money in her accounts had come from, positioning herself as an innocent victim of David's schemes. He'd lost everything. The houses, plural, because there had been 3. The cars, the boats, the club memberships, the investments, all of it seized or sold to pay back investors and settle lawsuits. He was facing multiple charges of fraud and forgery. His lawyer had negotiated a plea deal that would keep him out of prison, but barely. Community service, restitution payments that would take decades to complete, and a reputation so damaged that he'd never work in real estate again. He found the letter he'd written to Margaret weeks ago, the one he'd never sent because he didn't know where to send it. He read it again, the words feeling hollow even to himself. "I'm sorry. I know. That's not enough. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. But I needed you to know. I'm sorry." The truth was, sorry didn't begin to cover it. Sorry was what you said when you accidentally bumped into someone, when you forgot an anniversary, when you said something thoughtless. But what David had done required a bigger word, a deeper acknowledgement, and even then, no word would be enough. Because he hadn't just hurt Margaret, he'd tried to erase her, tried to steal her history, her legacy, her identity, and there was no apology big enough for that. Margaret didn't look back, not once. She spent the first month in that modest hotel room, working with Thomas and Claire to finalize everything. The legal proceedings moved quickly once the evidence was presented. The banks confirmed the forged signatures. The investors withdrew their support. The city issued violations, and David, faced with overwhelming evidence and the threat of prison time, agreed to a settlement. He would relinquish all claims to Margaret's land. He would return every penny he'd stolen from their joint accounts, plus interest. He would accept responsibility for the fraud, and he would never contact Margaret again. It was over. Legally, financially, emotionally, over. With the settlement money and her reclaimed inheritance, Margaret did something David would never have expected. She didn't buy a mansion. She didn't take a lavish vacation. She didn't spend a single dollar on revenge or spite. Instead, she went back to the ranch, back to the land her father had loved, back to the place where she'd been happiest as a child. The first thing she did was hire contractors to restore the old barn. The red paint had faded to pink, the roof had holes, the doors hung crooked on rusty hinges. But the bones were good. Her father had built it to last. They spent 2 months rebuilding it, replacing rotted wood, patching the roof, painting it the deep red it had been when she was young. When it was finished, Margaret stood in the doorway and cried, not from sadness, but from coming home. Next came the house. The small ranch house where she'd grown up had been empty for years, slowly deteriorating. Margaret brought in a team to renovate it, preserving as much of the original structure as possible. Her father's workshop in the garage, her mother's kitchen with the window over the sink that looked out at the fields, her childhood bedroom with the view of the oak tree. She kept it all, restoring rather than replacing, honoring the memories while making it livable again. And in the space where the old chicken coop had been, she built something new, a guest house. Simple, comfortable, welcoming. Because Margaret had a vision, and that vision required space for others. She named it Second Roots, a retreat center for women healing from betrayal, from divorce, from loss, women who'd been erased, diminished, forgotten, women who needed time and space to remember who they were before the person who hurt them. Margaret opened the doors in late spring, 6 months after she'd left David. The first guest was a woman named Sarah, 43, recently divorced after her husband of 20 years left her for his assistant. Sarah arrived with 2 suitcases and eyes that had cried too many tears. She was still wearing her wedding ring, even though the papers were signed. Margaret greeted her at the door, led her to the guest house, and said something simple but profound. "You're safe here. You can take all the time you need to heal." Sarah cried the first night, sitting on the porch under a sky full of stars. Margaret sat beside her, silent, understanding. They didn't need words. They were connected by something deeper than conversation. The shared experience of loving someone who didn't deserve it, of giving everything and receiving betrayal in return, of having to rebuild from nothing. After a long while, Sarah finally spoke. "How did you do it? How did you walk away and not look back?" Margaret smiled softly, staring out at the fields. "I remembered who I was before I met him, and I decided that woman deserved a second chance." Sarah turned to look at her. "Do you think I can do that?" Margaret met her eyes. "I know you can, because you're already here, and that's the hardest step." Sarah stayed for 3 weeks. In that time, she helped Margaret plant a garden. She learned to ride the horses Margaret had rescued from a nearby farm. She sat by the creek and read books she'd been meaning to read for years. She journaled, she cried, she laughed. And slowly, day by day, she started to remember herself. The woman who'd loved painting before her husband said it was a waste of time. The woman who'd dreamed of opening a bookstore before she'd given up her dreams to support his career. The woman who'd been funny and confident before she'd learned to make herself small. On her last day, Sarah hugged Margaret tightly. "Thank you," she whispered, "for showing me I'm not broken, just healing." Margaret held her close. "You were never broken, Sarah, just lost, and now you've found your way home." The retreat grew. Word spread through support groups, therapists' offices, online forums. Women came from across Texas, then across the country. Some stayed a weekend, some stayed a month. Each one arrived carrying pain and left carrying hope. Margaret hired staff, a therapist who offered counseling sessions, a yoga instructor who taught morning classes in the barn, a chef who prepared healthy, nourishing meals. And slowly, Second Roots became more than a retreat center. It became a community, a sisterhood, a place where women could be vulnerable without judgment, where they could be angry without apology, where they could be themselves without pretense. Margaret found peace in the quiet of the Texas fields, in the sound of wind through the grass, in the smell of coffee at dawn, in the simple, honest work of healing, both herself and others. She adopted 2 dogs from the local shelter, mutts with scruffy fur and grateful eyes. She learned to bake bread, something her mother used to do every Saturday. She started painting again, a hobby she'd abandoned during her marriage. She reconnected with old friends, people she'd lost touch with, while she was busy being David's wife. And she discovered something profound. She didn't need a man to complete her. She didn't need wealth or status, or a mansion in Dallas. She needed purpose. She needed peace. She needed to be herself, fully and unapologetically. One evening, about a year after she'd left David, Margaret sat on the porch of her father's house, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. The dogs were at her feet. A cup of tea was cooling in her hands, and for the first time in years, she felt complete. Not because she'd won, not because David had lost, but because she'd found herself again. She thought about her father, about the lessons he'd taught her. Stand up for what's right. Protect what's yours. Don't let anyone make you feel small. She'd forgotten those lessons during her marriage, let them slip away in the face of David's ambition and charm, but she'd found them again, and she'd never forget them again. David's life after the collapse was nothing like he'd imagined. He moved into a small apartment on the outskirts of Dallas, the kind of place he would have sneered at during his Empire days. One bedroom, a kitchenette with appliances from the 90s, thin walls through which he could hear his neighbors arguing. It was humbling. It was humiliating. It was exactly what he deserved. He took a job as a property manager for a small rental company, making a fraction of what he used to earn. His days were spent fixing leaky faucets, dealing with tenant complaints, collecting rent from people who sometimes couldn't afford to pay. It was honest work, hard work, the kind of work he'd built his empire to avoid. But it was all he could get with his reputation destroyed and his name associated with fraud. The community service hours were the worst part, not because the work was difficult, but because of who he encountered. He volunteered at a food bank, serving meals to people who'd lost everything, and every face reminded him of what he'd almost done to Margaret, how he'd almost left her with nothing, how he'd planned to discard her after stealing everything she had. One day, an older woman came through the line. She reminded him of Margaret's mother, who'd passed away years ago. The woman smiled at him, grateful for the hot meal, and said, "God bless you for doing this." David had to turn away, because he wasn't doing it to be blessed. He was doing it because a judge had ordered him to, because it was part of his plea deal, because if he didn't, he'd go to prison. There was nothing noble about it. At night, alone in his small apartment, David thought about Margaret constantly. He wondered where she was, what she was doing, if she was happy. He thought about the early days of their relationship, when they'd been partners in every sense of the word, when they'd stayed up late planning their future, their voices filled with excitement and hope, when he'd loved her not for what she could give him, but for who she was. When had that changed? When had ambition become more important than love? When had success become worth more than loyalty? He couldn't pinpoint the exact moment. It had been gradual, a slow erosion of values he'd once held dear, and by the time he'd realized what he'd lost, it was too late. 18 months after Margaret left, David was working at one of the rental properties, fixing a broken porch railing, when he saw her. Not Margaret, but her sister Emily. She was there visiting a friend who lived in one of the units. Their eyes met across the parking lot. For a moment, neither moved. Then Emily walked over, her expression unreadable. "David," she said simply. "Emily," he replied, setting down his tools. "How's Margaret?" Emily studied him for a long moment before answering. "She's better than she's ever been. She's helping other women heal from what men like you did to them. And she's happy, David. Truly happy, in a way she never was with you." The words cut deep, but David nodded. He deserved that. "I'm glad," he said quietly. "I mean that. I'm glad she's happy." Emily tilted her head, surprised by the sincerity in his voice. "Have you changed? Or are you just sorry you got caught?" It was a fair question, one David had asked himself many times. "I think," he said slowly, choosing his words carefully, "I was so focused on building an empire that I forgot what I was building it for. I thought success would make me happy, thought money and power would fill something inside me, but all it did was make me empty and cruel and willing to hurt the one person who'd never hurt me." Emily crossed her arms. "That's not an answer to my question." David met her eyes. "I've changed, not because I got caught, but because I finally understand what I lost. Margaret was the best thing that ever happened to me, and I threw her away like she was nothing. I can't undo that. I can't fix it. But I can make sure I never become that person again." Emily studied him for another moment, then nodded slowly. For what it's worth, I believe you. But David, Margaret's moved on. She's built a life that doesn't include you, and she deserves to live it without you trying to come back into it. I know, David said. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm not asking for another chance. I just needed you to know that I know what I did. And I'm sorry. Emily softened slightly. I'll tell her I saw you. But don't expect her to reach out. She won't. David nodded. I understand. Emily turned to leave, then paused. David? He looked up. That woman you left her for, where is she now? David laughed bitterly. Gone. The moment the money dried up, she disappeared. Hasn't returned a single one of my calls. Emily shook her head. Calm as real. And then she walked away, leaving David standing alone in the parking lot with his broken porch railing and his broken life. 2 years after leaving David, Margaret received an unexpected letter. It wasn't from David. It was from Vanessa, the mistress. Margaret stared at the return address for a long moment, debating whether to open it or throw it away. Curiosity won. She opened the envelope carefully and pulled out a single handwritten page. Dear Margaret, it began, I don't expect you to read this. I don't expect you to respond, but I needed to write it anyway. I need you to know that I'm sorry, not the kind of sorry that expects forgiveness, but the kind that acknowledges I was wrong. I was young and stupid and selfish. When I met David, he told me his marriage was over, that you and he were separated, that you'd agreed to divorce but hadn't filed the papers yet. I believed him because I wanted to, because he was successful and charming and he made me feel special, the letter continued. I didn't know about the forged documents. I didn't know he was stealing from you. When investigators started asking questions, when I realized the money he'd given me wasn't his to give, I was horrified. I hired a lawyer. I returned everything I could. I testified against him when the prosecutors asked, not to hurt him, but because it was the right thing to do. I know that doesn't make up for what I did. I know I helped destroy your marriage, but I want you to know that I've changed. I moved back home. I went back to school. I'm working as a teacher now, trying to do something meaningful with my life. And every day, I think about you, about what you lost because of me, about the pain I caused. I'm so sorry. Vanessa. Margaret read the letter twice, then set it down on her kitchen table. She felt no anger, no bitterness, just a strange sort of emptiness where those emotions should have been. Because Vanessa wasn't the villain. David wasn't even the villain. They were just flawed people who'd made terrible choices. And Margaret had made the choice to stop letting those choices define her life. She picked up a pen and wrote a brief response. Vanessa, thank you for your letter. I appreciate your honesty. I'm not ready to say I forgive you, because forgiveness is a process, not a decision. But I want you to know that I don't hate you. I don't wish you harm. I hope you've learned from this and that you're building a better life. We all deserve second chances, even people who hurt us. Margaret. She sealed the envelope, addressed it, and mailed it that afternoon. And then she let it go, because holding on to anger was like drinking poison and expecting someone else to die. That spring, Second Route celebrated its second anniversary. The retreat had grown beyond Margaret's wildest dreams. They'd hosted over 200 women, built 2 more guest houses, expanded the programs to include art therapy, equine therapy, and financial literacy classes. Margaret had hired a staff of 12, all women who'd been through their own healing journeys, and the stories kept coming. Stories of women who'd rediscovered themselves, who'd rebuilt their lives, who'd learned to trust again. Each story was a victory, each woman a testament to the power of resilience. During the anniversary celebration, Margaret stood on the porch of her father's house, looking out at the women gathered on the lawn. Some were current guests. Some were alumni who'd come back to celebrate. All of them were laughing, talking, connecting. And Margaret realized something profound. She'd built something more valuable than David's empire. She'd built a community, a legacy, a place that changed lives. Her father would have been proud. Her mother too. And Margaret, looking at the faces of these strong, beautiful, resilient women, was proud of herself. Not in an arrogant way, but in the quiet, deep way that comes from knowing you've done something meaningful. One of the guests, a woman named Rachel who'd arrived 3 weeks earlier, approached Margaret. "Can I talk to you for a minute?" she asked. "Of course," Margaret said, leading her to a quiet corner of the porch. Rachel hesitated, then spoke. I just wanted to say thank you. Before I came here, I was ready to give up. My husband had left me for his secretary, cleaned out our bank accounts, left me with nothing but debt and 2 kids to raise. I felt worthless, like I'd failed at everything that mattered. But being here, talking to you and the other women, I realized something. I didn't fail. He did. And my worth isn't determined by whether someone chose to stay or leave. It's determined by who I choose to be. Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. Rachel, that's beautiful. And it's true. You're not defined by what happened to you. You're defined by how you rise from it. Rachel nodded, wiping her own tears. I'm going to make it. I don't know how yet, but I know I will. Margaret squeezed her hand. You will. Because you're stronger than you know, and you're not alone. Rachel hugged her tightly, and Margaret held her, feeling the weight of her pain and the strength of her determination. This, she thought, was why she'd built Second Roots. For moments like this. For women like Rachel, who just needed someone to believe in them until they could believe in themselves again. 3 years after leaving David, Margaret received one final letter. This one was from Thomas, the family lawyer. Margaret, it read, I thought you should know. David's finished his community service. He's paid back what he owed. He's working a regular job and living a quiet life. He asked me to tell you something. He said, tell Margaret I finally understand. It was never about the empire. It was about having someone to share it with. And I threw that away. He's not asking for forgiveness. He's not asking to see you. He just wanted you to know that he gets it now. I don't know if this matters to you, but I thought you should hear it. Thomas. Margaret sat with the letter for a long time. Part of her was glad David had changed, glad he'd learned something from the devastation he'd caused, but another part of her didn't care, because his journey wasn't hers to worry about anymore. She'd moved on, built a life that had nothing to do with him, and whether he was sorry or not didn't change what had happened, didn't undo the pain, didn't restore the years she'd lost, but it did give her closure. The kind of closure that comes from knowing the person who hurt you finally understands the weight of what they did. She folded the letter, placed it in a drawer with the others, and closed it. That chapter was done. Margaret walked outside to the fields, the evening sun casting long shadows across the land. She thought about her father, about the legacy he'd left her. Not just land, but values, integrity, strength, the courage to stand up for what's right. She'd almost lost those values during her marriage to David, almost let him convince her that her worth was tied to his success, but she'd found them again, and in finding them, she'd found herself. She thought about the women at Second Roots, each one fighting their own battles, each one learning to believe in themselves again, and she felt grateful, not for the pain, not for the betrayal, but for the opportunity to turn that pain into purpose. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold, Margaret made a promise to herself. She would never again make herself small for someone else's comfort, never again sacrifice her identity for someone else's ambition, never again stay silent when she deserved to be heard, because she'd learned the hardest lesson of all, that the only person who can truly save you is yourself, that love without respect is just pretty words, and that sometimes walking away is the bravest thing you can do. Margaret turned back toward the house, toward the life she'd built, toward the future she was creating, and for the first time since her father had died, she felt him with her, felt his pride in what she'd accomplished, heard his voice in the wind, strong and clear. You did good, Margaret. You protected what's ours. You stood up for yourself. I'm proud of you. She smiled through tears, looking up at the darkening sky. Thanks, Daddy. I learned from the best. Stories like this remind us that sometimes the quietest exit is the loudest message, and not every loss is the end. Some are the beginning of something greater. Margaret didn't need revenge. She didn't need David to suffer or apologize or beg for forgiveness. She needed to reclaim herself, to remember who she was before someone else tried to define her, and in doing that, she found something more valuable than any empire. She found peace, she found purpose, she found herself. So let me ask you, what would you have done in Margaret's place? Would you have confronted him immediately? Would you have stayed and tried to work it out? Or would you have walked away quietly, taking back what was yours? Drop your honest thoughts in the comments. No judgment, just real people sharing real perspectives, because these stories matter. They remind us that we're not alone in our struggles, that betrayal doesn't have to break us, that we have the power to rebuild, no matter how much we've lost. And let me ask you something else. Have you ever had to walk away from someone you loved? Have you ever had to choose between staying in a situation that was killing you slowly, or leaving and starting over with nothing? If you have, I want you to know something. You're stronger than you think. The fact that you survived means you're a warrior. And if you're still in that situation right now, still trying to decide whether to stay or go, hear this: you deserve better. You deserve love that doesn't require you to shrink. You deserve respect that doesn't need to be earned over and over. You deserve a partner who values you, not one who erases you. If this story moved you, if it made you think about your own life, your own worth, your own strength, then do me a favor, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Because sometimes the stories that break our hearts are the ones that remind us we're strong enough to heal. Hit that subscribe button so you never miss a story that might just change your life. Because every week, we bring you real stories about real people facing real challenges. And every story has a lesson, a message, a reminder that we're all more resilient than we know. Thank you for watching this journey with me. Thank you for staying until the end. Thank you for being part of this community that believes in second chances, in healing, in the power of reclaiming your story. Remember, you are never defined by who loved you or who left you. You are defined by who you choose to become after they're gone. And that choice, that's where your power lives. Until next time, stay strong, stay true to yourself, and never forget that your story isn't over. It's just beginning.